We as human beings have done incredible feats. We've put a man on the moon. We've managed to connect the world globally in ways that are unprecedented. One of the things we haven't been able to do is increase the amount of land we have. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why the land issue is so emotive. Land is also quite fundamentally linked to very strong human connotations of heritage, belonging, and the idea of home. So, this is the issue that we're trying to debate today. Many agree that South Africa's main economic challenges relate to poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So it follows then that any land reform and restitution initiative that is done has to be measured against its ability to address these triple challenges. I think the link between security of property rights on the one hand and the level of economic growth and investment on the other is undeniable. The International Property Rights Index scores countries on their level of property rights, on the state of property rights within them. It covers 125 countries representing 98% of the world's GDP, and it divides countries into a number of blocks. The top 20%, second, third, and fourth quintile, and the bottom 20%. You can see over there that South Africa is in the second quintile. The 2018 results reveal some interesting findings. Firstly, there's a strong correlation between countries with a high property rights index and the GDP per capita of those countries. In fact, the GDP per capita of countries in the top 20 is 20 times higher than the GDP per capita of countries in the bottom 20. In other words, people living in countries with high property rights index are on average 20 times richer than those living in countries with a low property rights index. There's also a good correlation between a high property rights index and the level of gross capital formation or investment in fixed assets. The PRI score also shows a positive, albeit moderate, correlation with foreign investment. And this means that there's more investment in fixed assets, both by domestic and foreign individuals in countries with a high property rights index. But by far the highest correlation, which I thought was interesting, between property rights index is that with the Global Entrepreneurial Development Index. This means that countries with a high PRI have citizens who have a high entrepreneurial attitudes, abilities, and aspirations. Look, the results in and of themselves are not surprising. People who live in countries that have secure property rights regimes are generally richer, they're more entrepreneurial, and they experience more investment into their countries, both from domestic and foreign sources. As advisors to many of South Africa's largest employer-based retirement schemes, we at Old Mutual Corporate Consultants regularly engage with a number of asset consultants on behalf of our clients. We've recently done a survey of 5 of the top asset consultants in the country about their views on land reform and restitution. The sample of asset managers, although small, it collectively manages about $1 trillion of retirement fund assets, which is almost half of what is in that asset pool. And some of the results are here. So we asked the asset managers, how do you view the latest development on land reform and restitution? Are they positive, negative, or neutral for the long-term prospects of South Africa's investment returns? 2 of the asset managers said the developments are positive or positive-ish. 2 said they were neutral, and 1 said they were negative. We also asked them, have you changed your investment management approach to take into account the latest development on land reform, including the possibility of land expropriation without compensation? So 1 said that they had changed, and 4 said that they had not done any changes. Although I must say that the 1 asset manager who had done some changes to their investment management approach was also the one who said that they felt negative about the latest development. They also did say that they had already maximized their offshore allocation even before there was talk of the possibility of expropriation without compensation. The sample is small, as I said, but I believe it's indicative given how much it represents. These are broad views of the people who are currently managing South Africa's biggest pool of private wealth, which is retirement funds. And I think as people who spend all day analyzing and making investment decisions, it would behove us well to strongly consider their views on land reform in informing our own views, as well as in making decisions in the organizations that we run and are responsible for. As you can imagine, there was quite a lot that came out of the survey, and I'm hoping that during the panel discussion and over some of the media interactions in the next few days, we can unpack a bit more detail. But I have to say, by far, the greatest insights came from the verbatim comments that these asset managers gave us. And I've tried to summarize some of the key themes that came out of these comments. The first theme was that there's a good way of doing land reform and restitution and a bad way of doing it from an economic perspective. And everyone agreed on this. Where they differed was on the level of upside of doing it correctly. So you had a number of them who said, look, if you do it correctly, you can unleash growth and you can have significant rally in the value of investment assets. But some of them said, well, if you do it correctly, it's okay, but actually it's just a hygiene factor. It's not going to make much of a difference. The second theme was that, which I must say was a bit surprising for me, was that there's still significant opportunity in South Africa. Despite regulations allowing it, none of these asset managers had significantly reduced their exposure to South African equities. In fact, all of them maintained very high exposures to South African equities and stocks, although they were a bit more selective in the type of stocks that they selected. And then the last theme was actually not surprising at all, which is uncertainty is risk. And I think this is really the crux of the issue, the fact that the longer we sit without a clear idea of how land reform and restitution is to be implemented, including expropriation without compensation, the more risk is perceived in our economy. These findings don't make our deliberations today any easier, unfortunately. But it's precisely why we've gathered this esteemed panel for you, in order that they may shed light on some of the further considerations within this broad topic. We've also got among us some of our mutuals executives, as have been introduced, and I'm hoping that collectively we will have a decent discussion on these issues. I think in discussing land reform, it's useful to think beyond just land in the basic sense. If we agree that the whole purpose is to reduce wealth inequality, then I think we've got to think beyond land, because more than 75% of South Africa's income is derived from services sector, which is not really linked in a direct way to land ownership. So it follows certainly that if we're distributing land amongst the poor, especially agricultural land, that may not necessarily be the most efficient way to reduce wealth inequality. By far, the most productive factors of production in today's economy are skills, knowledge, access to markets, and other intangibles like that. And I think it's important that we start thinking about how we redistribute those types of assets as well. Finally, looking at other countries' experiences, we have a number of workable models for land reform. And I'm certainly looking forward to the contribution of Ambassador Dr. Park on the South Korean experience. So, it's quite clear. Property rights are important. Land redistribution needs to be done in the right way, and asset managers are generally positive about the country. Except it's not so clear, because one cannot have this discussion without talking about social justice. In what has become a fairly famous YouTube clip now that's been put up by ANZ Banking Group of New Zealand, there's a group of 6-year-old boys and girls who are called and they're given a task, and then they are rewarded afterwards, except there's a twist. The girls are paid less than the boys. And then what follows is a discussion between the moderator and the children themselves about just how unfair this whole thing is. And the children are clearly appalled at this unfairness. So it seems that the idea of fairness is ingrained in us as humans from an early age. And this translates not just at an individual level, but at a societal level as well. Social justice is defined in terms of justice by distribution of wealth, opportunities, and social privileges. And has already been said, South Africa has quite a long history of land dispossessions, ranging from colonial times to forced removals of apartheid. What is also abundantly clear is that land ownership is heavily skewed by race. According to the Department of Rural Development's land audits, this is the distribution of land in South Africa by race. Regardless of whether one agrees with the numbers or not, I think the patterns are certainly legitimate. I had the opportunity to listen to recordings of the community submissions into the Joint Committee on Constitutional Review for Section 25 of the Constitution. And far be it for me to try and summarize those because they were quite diverse and they were very lengthy and they came from very different people across the spectrum of our country. But two things which jumped out at me from listening to those are the following. Firstly, a lot of the submissions seemed to talk about land distribution as a matter of principle, in complete isolation to how it affects the economy or investments and so on. And I think, one might say this is well expected because the average person doesn't really bother themselves with the complexities of investment confidence and performance of investment assets. But on the other hand, it could just be an indication that the average landless and disadvantaged South African does not see a stake for themselves in this economy. The second thing which struck out at me was just the level of expectation that already seems to have been built up by merely having those committees going out to the community. I specifically remember a woman in Mpumalanga Township who gave a very impassioned submission on why the Constitution needs to be changed, and she ended her submission with a chant of 1 woman, 1 hectare. And I quickly did a sum in my head to kind of see whether this would work out. And after a while, I pulled out a calculator because it's a difficult sum. But the point is, there's a very high level of expectation that's already been built up. And I think that we would be doing a great mistake if we ignore the high expectations of the landless and disenfranchised population. In reflecting on this issue, the former president, Thabo Mbeki, quotes a poet, Langston Hughes, and asks the question, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or does it explode? Nobel-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz argues quite convincingly that inequality is associated with economic instability. He says that growth spells tend to be shorter when inequality is high. In fact, the stats he quotes is that a 10% decrease in inequality can lead to a 50% increase in the expected growth spells. We also know, just from intuition and history, I guess, that perceptions of unfair wealth distribution can lead to populism, short-termism, and desperation. In writing about the French Revolution, Albert Cockburn, a British historian, concludes that despite all of the shortcomings of that bloody period, one of the lasting legacies of the revolution was to bequeath on France a class of landowners for the very first time. So, property rights, key to investment and growth, but without social justice, the economy and its stability is in fact under threat. And I think what makes land reform and redistribution so complicated is that it brings these two issues squarely on the table and in juxtaposition to each other. And I think in addition maybe to looking at the big picture, there's also a number of fairly practical things that we've got to think about if we are thinking about land reform and distribution and even expropriation without compensation possibly. One of them is this urban versus rural divide. Should land reform on urban land be the same as on rural land? Herman has already alluded to that question as it is. But also, how do we take into account land owned by trusts? So does land held by trusts on behalf of a community belong to the beneficiaries of that trust? Or should we look at those who are controlling the trust, who in fact may be very different to the beneficiaries and be belonging to a different socioeconomic status. And I think this extends to retirement funds as well, which are themselves a form of trust. The new voluntary financial sector charter scorecard for retirement funds advises retirement funds to disclose the proportion of assets held by those retirement funds which belong to Black members. And I think this may start to improve the reporting and measurement of beneficial ownership in trusts. And this is quite an important thing because a significant portion of investable assets, including land, is owned through retirement funds. The other question is, why would you start a journey if you don't know where you're going? What is the target end state? We know what the current land distribution is by race, by income levels, by many measures, but where are we going? At what point do we stop? How do we know that we've reached success? And I think that's a useful question for policymakers in thinking about this, because it may just end up being a recurring issue if we do not define what success looks like in the first place. And obviously, some practical questions as the born frees now start entering the working population. Are they eligible to claim for land that is being redistributed and so on? And if expropriation without compensation does become a reality, who will pay for the land and the property that is financed through various commercial banks? Mr. Kiaskuvare is here, and I'm hoping that he can give us some thoughts on this, not just on the question, but also on some of the answers. But look, we can talk all we want. Ultimately, the state defines the rules of engagement in the economy and in our country. And I'm certainly encouraged to hear President Ramaphosa talk about pragmatism and risk awareness in approaching land reform. And I look forward to the contributions of Ms. Trudy Makaya as a representative of the presidency. So the issues are complex, the stakes are incredibly high. And as All Mutual Corporate Consultants, we advise organizations on various investment and retirement-related things. For us, land reform is not a passing interest. It is central to long-term investment planning. We've brought some of the best minds in the country on this issue, and we aim to have a sober and fact-based discussion. And we hope that you walk away with a sense of the scale of risk and opportunity that this presents for us. This is not the first time South Africa has had to make a decision navigating complex long-term issues, and it certainly won't be the last time. What gives me confidence personally is that time and time again, we have collectively come up with workable solutions to seemingly intractable problems. We have the collective intellectual capacity, the goodwill, the courage, and the basic common sense to meet this challenge head on. And I alluded earlier to the fact that one thing we have not been able to do is increase the amount of land we have. But full disclosure, with Elon Musk's adventures, maybe we may just have a whole other planet that we need to fight over. So even problems that seem like they don't have solutions can have them. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussions and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.